Hi After School Builders, Happyakrz here. And for January, our kit for the month of January, because January is National Braille Literacy Month, I was really excited. I had kind of a funny idea. What you're going to learn about in your after school program is that Braille is a language. It's a written language for blind people so that they can read. And it's basically using a process of dots that they can feel with their fingertips. They get hypersensitive to it so that they can read just like we can read with our eyes. They can read with their fingers. And when I looked at the patterns that were used to create Braille letters, I instantly recognized how easy it would be to convert Braille into Lego, or to use Lego to write in Braille. So my thought was, could I come up with a device that could spell out words when you press a button or press a lever? And my original intent was to have two different words on the same device. Push a button here and it'll say Grant, push a button there and it'll say Tigers, something like that. But for the guts of the device to work like that was it was a nightmare. So what I did was I pared it down and developed a kit that basically spells out Grant. And then on the cover, I went ahead and put the Grant Tiger logo. But when you press this lever right here, up pops the dots for the word Grant. When it's down, you can't tell. Up they go, and that spells Grant in Braille. And a blind person who's familiar with Braille would be able to feel that and say the word Grant. They would know exactly what it is. And Braille is more popular than you think, or I should say more common. It's out there where you don't necessarily expect to see it. Next time you're in an elevator, look at the numbers for the floors. There's usually Braille right next to those. Or when your mom or dad go to the ATM to get out some cash, there are actually Braille numbers and letter indicators on those devices as well. So Braille is something that's really fun to learn about, and I figured that this would be a perfect way to showcase National Braille Literacy Month so that we can see just what it takes to even say one word, 5 letters, in another written language. So enjoy the build. It is a little bit more technical. There are very few plates or bricks. It's almost 100% technique and gears or axles. But I'm going to walk you through it very carefully in the video, and the PDF instructions are pretty clear. So have fun with it, enjoy, and make sure that you show off to all your friends and family when you're done, because this is a really cool project that most likely they've never seen anything like it.
As I indicated in the introduction, this kit is made predominantly from technique parts. From lift arms to pins and axles. You're not going to see many plates or bricks in this kit. And as we open up the box, you'll see there's one bag really that's dedicated to the plates, and everything else is technique lift arms and pins. The pins in this kit come down to basically 4 different types, and because there are so many of them and so few of other parts that need to be sorted out, I would recommend just dumping them into a section of your tray. Don't spend the time to actually try to separate them all out. It's just going to be too time consuming, and it's easy to grab them once you're into the build. I'm also going to take the time to separate out my lift arms because as step by step we move through the build, you're going to need to grab different sizes almost all the time. So it'll be easier if you get at least an assortment of them out and ready to use. In some ways, this kit is similar to the stackers we've built in the past, but because of the use of the technique lift arms and pins, we have to make sure that certain connections are made, and sometimes those don't seem like they're exactly in sequence or in a standard stacker build, but ultimately they do come together from the bottom up to the top. And for the first few steps of this build, it will feel a little awkward because we're not actually connecting anything to other parts. We're actually getting prepped to do that by placing pins in the right spots, but we won't actually be connecting lift arms to each other until later steps. Pin placement is very important in this kit, and whenever using the long blue pins, always make sure that they go short end down, meaning just the smaller end before the stop should go in first facing down. That way you'll ensure that you have plenty of the longer end sticking straight up. And if you need to pause at any time to make sure that the placement is accurate to what you're seeing on the screen, feel free to do so. I would highly recommend that you also have the PDF instructions either printed or ready and available on your iPads or laptops so that you can look and see exactly where each pin is placed. The video should help, especially if you're able to pause it. But to make sure that you have everything just right, the PDF instructions will be very helpful. In step 3, we're going to add more lift arms to the next level up of the build, but they won't connect all of the parts to each other, so we're going to need to try to retain that basic shape that we've been using of one end of the Braille Speller. And as you'll experience many times in this build, when you're trying to place a long technique lift arm on top of multiple pins, it's best to use two hands, get it balanced evenly above the pins. Don't press down with one hand or the other. Press down together evenly, and that should push it down straight onto the pins. And here on step 3, I've already made my first mistake. Simple to fix, I just put it one hole over too far, so I'm pulling that piece off, I'm correcting the placement, and putting it back on. Now it's accurate. Step 4 is the continuation of the building of the shape of the speller. It's going back down to the first level of technique lift arms, and as you see, I'm just outlining basically the shape, getting it ready for the addition of more pins and more layers. As you can see, it's okay to grab a part and pull it away from the shape so that you can insert the pins. As long as you put it back where it belongs in the overall build, it shouldn't be disruptive, and it's much easier to do it when you can move the parts around. And here's my only other oops for this build. That last pin went in the wrong spot. Currently it's in the end hole of that lift arm. It should be one hole in, and I will correct that later in the video, and I'll show you where that happens. Sometimes trying to get a long lift arm to position over top of multiple pieces is just a little too tricky. So if you want to do it one little piece at a time, that's absolutely fine. Just make sure that they go in nice and solidly and click and connect completely. And here is where I discover that I've placed my pin incorrectly, so I move it and put the small lift arm on top properly. Pins will usually naturally slide into place in the holes on lift arms and Technique bricks, but once in a while they get a little pesky. The easiest thing to do is to place the pin below and press straight down onto it, and that will usually push it into place. And with the completion of step 9, we now have a complete bottom layer of the frame of the speller, plus the second level, to which we can begin to add the next set of long blue pins. And here we're going to finally start connecting the different sections of the frame to each other so that we'll have one continuous loop around the speller by connecting these corner pieces by the new pins. And now we have the third layer complete of the frame. And you'll notice that I spend a lot of time trying to straighten things out and making sure that all my lines are nice and even. You don't have to worry about that at this point because as we add more parts, it will straighten itself out. I just like to make sure that as you're watching, it's easy to see what lines should be straight and so on. Next, we're going to flip the frame over and prep the bottom section for the plates that will ultimately go on at the end. But for those plates to affix properly, we have to put these little half pins in place. Step 16 is the building of the actual lever that will make the Braille Speller operate. And as you'll see, the easiest way to get this section of the build completed is to get at least one of the red bushes in place on the axle before you try to place it into the lift arm, the small 1x2 lift arm that is on one side of the bracket, as you see in the picture here. These brackets are movable, so you can kind of slide them back and forth to get the best angle to get that axle in place. And once there, you want to push it through a little farther, just so that you can clear the next bush which has to go on. As you can see there, I pushed it through probably almost one stud length. Put the other bush on, rotate your bracket back in place, and then push the axle back through until you get it nice and even. Once everything is in place, you want to test the lever a little bit. It should fall very easily. It should not stick at all. You want to make sure that it's nice and loose. In step 21, we begin to add the actual L brackets, which will hold the internal mechanism of the Braille Speller in place. So make sure when you're placing these on the frame that the L brackets are going in the right shape and the L is pointing in the correct direction. As you may have noticed already, when I place the pins on the frame, I usually go in a counterclockwise direction, and I start usually at the gap where the lever is. But that way, when I work my way around the frame, I know kind of where I've started. I can gauge how many pins I have to go, and by looking at the instructions on the PDF file, I can tell exactly where I am and if I've missed anything. With step 26, we're now getting ready to put the pins in that will hold the top level, the final level of technique lift arms for the frame of the Braille Speller. So that's why we're pretty much done with all of the long blue pins. Now that the frame for the speller is done, we can start working on the inner parts, the inner workings that will actually allow those Braille letters to pop up when we press on the lever. The positioning of these cross beams is important, so make sure that on one end you're on the last hole, and on the other end you're the third hole in. So there should be 2 empty holes before you get to the peg that goes into that bar. Every Braille letter is made up of 6 possible dots in 2 rows of 3. So for this kit, we know that we're going to spell Grant, and I've already laid out how the letters for Grant should be pegged. So right now, in step 33, we're laying out half pin technique pieces where we don't need any movement. So when the lever is pressed, these spots will stay flat and even on the board. So with a row of empty holes between each letter, the blue half pins should represent the white circles, or the white empty filled circles, on the word Grant. With step 34, we begin to create the actual word, and we're starting with the letter G by placing these 3 L pins or axles with the knob end in position. Now, they're loose, so you can press up and down on them, but make sure you get them in the right positions. Those 4, making a square, creates the letter G. To lock them in place and to allow the machine to work properly, we need to connect things to the other side. So place your finger on top of the knobs, rotate it around, and hold those pins in place so that you can press the extensions onto the ends of the pins. Once you have each of the Technique connectors at least a little bit connected or put in place, you can set the whole plate down, face down, and then use your thumbs to really press those extensions home so that they're nice and seated well. At this stage, you don't need to be too worried about which direction those connectors are facing. I just like to make sure that they're typically facing in the right way so that you can see how they will end up. But as we continue to add more pieces, they'll jiggle around. Don't worry about that because we're going to end up aligning them at the end of this section. Continuing with the letter R, we flip the board back over and begin to place our pins. This time we're going to lock our pins in place with black Technique connectors. So once our pins are in place, again, place your fingers over top of the knob ends, flip the plate over, and begin to get the Technique connectors attached to the ends of those pins. Here I am being fussy again about getting everything lined up properly. You don't need to worry about doing this yet. The Braille letter A is really simple. It's only one dot in the upper left-hand corner. So again, put it in position, hold it with your finger, rotate, and this time we're using a light bluish gray Technique connector for the back side. Follow the same procedure for the letter N in Grant. We're going to use black Technique connectors again. And we'll finish the spelling of Grant by completing the letter R at the end of the plate. And this time we're going to use the bright orange Technique connectors on the back side. Now we have all of our letters in position and the connectors are all lined up, so we can begin to place our axles to hold everything together. We're going to start on the left side. I've broken down the word grant into two sections, GRA and NT. So this first section will cover the GRA, and we're going to use this 1x3 perpendicular lift arm. You want to make sure that you place it in position as you thread the axle through, and make sure that you also place two red bushes in between until you reach across to the light bluish gray connector, so that you cover all three letters with one axle. This will need a little strength in your fingers, so you may need to line it up properly, but if you push on the end, the axle should go all the way through and connect all the way from the near orange connector all the way through the light bluish gray connector. You can see the axle poking at the ends of each side. Once you have the axles in position, make sure that each position is loose. You don't want anything to be too tight for the machine not to be able to move properly. Also, as you're threading the next axle into place, make sure that you lift up that perpendicular lift arm so that you're going through the middle hole and reaching all the way across. Step 45 adds red bushes to each of the loose ends of these axles. So again, make sure that you get them in place so they're nice and connected, but that you don't press it so tightly that the parts don't want to move independently of one another. You want to keep it at least a little loose so that when they slide up and down with the lever movement, that they don't bind up and create tension. To test the system to see if it's too tight, you can wiggle it for looseness and then reach to the other side and actually work the action. If it moves up and down without any friction, you're good to go. With step 46, we start connecting the last two letters, the N and the T. And again, placing the red bushes on the ends of each of these axles is not so much about getting it tight as it is just making sure that the axles can't slide out. So you don't necessarily need to push them all the way in to touch next to the technique connectors. As long as they're connected at each end of the axle and the axle can't slide out of place, you're good. And again, you can test the looseness by tapping up and down from the bottom or lifting from the top, just to make sure there's no friction holding those letters in place. At this stage in the build, the workings of the speller are still rather loose, and they'll wobble back and forth, and they won't necessarily lift all of the letters in the same even fashion. But the more that we add to the kit, like this orange lift arm, the more stable it will be when it comes time to actually insert the workings onto the frame and press the lever. In step 52, we add the 1x1 flat tiles that are round to the top of our plate, on top of both the 1/2 pin blue pieces as well as our moving axles with the knob on the ends. This can be a little difficult at times. The plates don't always want to fit on super simply. But just with a little bit of extra pressure on the fingertips, they should snap into place and look very nice and uniform. And with step 53, we're now ready to add the workings into the frame. So make sure that you line up the lift arms on the workings with the pins that are coming out on the frame. They need to be as far back as they can go, so make sure that they are in the right position. This might take a little nudging back and forth to get the positioning just right, with 6 different pins trying to settle everything and fit and lock in place. It might just take a little bit of wobbling, but using both hands on even sides, you can get it to lock into place. And at this point, when you test the speller by pressing the lever, the axles inside should go up and down and fall smoothly into position and should be very even. The lift arms we add in step 54 are more about creating good structure for the upper surface that we're going to add to this speller. But I did make one mistake in my design, or actually in the purchasing for this design, and that is the piece that I just inserted that I'm touching right now should have had another lift arm under it, because if you press hard enough, it will go down. There is nothing to keep it from going down one level more, but we don't want it to. It should rest nicely here, so there's no worry, there's no need to put anything underneath it. But if you have an extra Technique lift arm that will fit in there, you might want to put it in. Otherwise, it's fine. You just don't want to press that piece down all the way. The rest of the pieces are fine as is. In step 55, we're actually going to connect the lever with the workings underneath, and it's a simple one axle that's going to go in. You're going to push it through the Technique connectors and through the last hole of the lever, and that will create one solid working movement within the speller. At this point in the build, if anything sticks or if there's friction involved when you press the lever, you're still able to get inside and reach areas where you can loosen up those bushes or loosen up those connections. So make sure that you test it, because once we start adding the covers, it's a lot harder to get to the action inside. In step 56, we're going to start placing the half pin blue Technique pieces that will affix our flat tiles to make the top of our speller look nice and clean. Just follow each step here and notice where I'm placing these pins, and you'll have no trouble getting all of them in place without missing any. This first 1x8 flat tile is going to seem a little silly because it wobbles almost the whole way through the rest of the build until you get the other plates in place. But don't worry, the 1/2 pin technique that is holding it in place will hold. It doesn't need more than that right now, but it does pivot on that 1 pin, so don't be surprised. In step 58, we're adding the 1/2 pins that will allow us to place our 2x2 flat tiles in position. So just make sure that you follow along with my placement, and it should offer you the opportunity of having 2 pins per square tile to affix those when the next step comes. Step 60 is the addition of our 1/2 pins for the outside edge of the Braille area. So I'm going to start down in the left-hand corner, and I'm going to work my way around using all of the pins. In step 63, we're going to build a small wall that will attach both to the bottom and the top plates right next to the inner workings of the speller, but it will create a small cavity for us, a small hiding place within the speller that will allow you to hold things without getting mixed up into the workings of the speller itself. When adding the plates to the bottom of the speller, make sure that you get them firmly attached in all cases, especially this piece, as it's going to go over and it's going to hold the bottom portion of that wall in place. And now that the speller is basically built, we can add some decoration with the Grant Tiger Paw. Make sure that you follow the diagram as closely as you can in the PDF instructions and while watching this video, because you don't want to place any of these longer flat tiles across the gap of the plates beneath it. You'll understand why in a couple minutes. And with that final quarter round tile, our creation is complete. We have a nice Braille Speller with the Grant Tiger paw logo on it. It spells Grant in Braille. You can test it. It goes up and down smoothly. And we have a secret hidden storage space. This is why you didn't want to cross your seams when you placed those flat tiles on top, so that those parts would come off nice and evenly. So you can place, some hidden money or fun things, keepsakes that go inside, and close it back up, and it's a nice hiding spot. I hope you enjoyed the build. It was very fun to create and learn more about Braille, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.